people. Shaggy the Writer coming at you live once again with another reading of Charles Dickens's classic Oliver Twist. Hopefully, the quality of my camera doesn't keep people from enjoying this. Um, Trust and believe I'm going to be pissing some people off today. But we're going to start with our recap.
Last time on Oliver Twist. Having been shot and abandoned in the gutter, everyone wonders whether Oliver has made it out of the robbery alive.
So that's where we're at. Basically, Fagin's going around trying to see if Oliver's still around. If there are any questions, I'm just gonna have to hold off on answering them for a little bit today because I'm trying to make this a little more episodic, so that it's more entertaining when people go to watch this after the fact as well. Um, so I guess sunspot activity isn't gonna uh, completely prevent this from being a thing, but it is gonna slow down my internet today as well. So, um, 1 second, and then we'll dive right into this. Chapter 28. Or, I'm sorry, Chapter 27. Tones for the unpoliteness of a former chapter, which deserted a lady most unceremoniously. As it would be by no means seemly in a humble author to keep so mighty a personage's beadle waiting with his back to the fire, and the skirts of his coat gathered up under his arms, under such a time as it might suit his pleasure to relieve him, as it would still less become his situation or his gallantry to involve in the same neglect a lady on whom that beadle had looked with an eye of tenderness and affection, and in whose ear he whispered the sweet words which, coming from such a quarter, might well thrill the blossom of a maid or matron, whatsoever degree. The historian whose pen traces these words, trusting that he knows his place, and that he entertains a becoming reverence for those upon earth to whom high and important authority is delegated, hastens to pay them with respect which their position demands, and treat them with all that duteous ceremony which their exalted rank, and by consequence great virtues, imperatively claim at his hands. Towards the end, indeed, he had proposed to introduce in this place a dissertation touching the divine right of beetles, and Euclidative of the position that a beetle can do no wrong, which could not fail to have been both pleasurable and profitable to the right-minded reader, but which he is unfortunately compelled, um, by want of time and space, to postpone to some more convenient and fitting opportunity, on the arrival of which he will be prepared to show that a beetle properly constituted, that is to say, a proarchal beetle attached to a parochial warehouse, and attending in his official capacity the parochial church, is in right and virtue of his office possessed of all excellences and best qualities of humanity, and that of none of those excellences can mere company's beetles, or court of law beetles, or even chapel of ease beetles, save the last, and they of very lowly and inferior degree, lay the remotest sustainable claim. Mr. Bumble had recounted the teaspoons and reweighed the sugar tongs, and made a closer inspection of the milk pot, and ascertained to a nicety the exact condition of the furniture, down to the very horsehair seats of the chairs, which repeated each process full half dozen times before he began to think it was time for Mrs. Corney to return. Thinking begets thinking, and as if there were no sounds of Mrs. Corney's approach, it occurred to Mr. Bumble that it would not be an innocent and virtuous way of spending time if he were further to allay his curiosity by a cursory glance into the interior of Mr. Corney's chest of drawers. Uh-oh. Having listened at the keyhole to assure himself that nobody was approaching the chamber, Mr. Bumble, beginning at the bottom, proceeded to make himself acquainted with the contents of the 3 long drawers, which, being filled with various garments of good fashion and texture, carefully preserved between 2 layers of old newspapers, speckled with dry lavender, seemed to yield him exceeding satisfaction, arriving in course of time at the right-hand corner drawer, in which was the key of coin. Mr. Bumble returned to a steady walk to the fireplace, and resuming his old attitude, said with a grave and determined air, "Oh, do it!" He followed up this remarkable declaration by shaking his head in a waggish manner for 10 minutes, as though he were remonstrating with himself for being such a pleasant dog, and then he took view of his legs in profile, which seemed pleasure and interest. He was still placidly edged on this later survey when Mrs. Corney, hurrying to the room, threw herself in a breathless state on the chair by the fireside, and covering her eyes with one hand, placed the other over her heart and gasped for breath. Mrs. Mrs. Corney, said Mr. Bumble, stooping over the matron, what is this, mum? Is anything happening, mum? Pray answer me, or I'm on. Mr. Bumble, in his alarm, could not immediately think of the word tenterhooks, so he said, well, who is dared to? Oh, I know, said Mr. Bumble, checking himself with native majesty. This is them wishes paupers. It's dreadful to think of, said the lady, shuddering. You know I don't know of it, ma'am, rejoined Mr. Bumble. I can't help, whispered the lady. Then take something, mum, said Mr. Bumble soothingly. A little of your wine? Not for the world, replied Mrs. Coney. Oh, I couldn't do. The top shelf of the right-hand corner. Oh. Uttering these words, the good lady pointed distractedly to the cupboard and underwent convulsion from internal spasms. Mr. Bumble rushed to the closet and, snatching a pint green glass bottle from the shelf thus incoherently indicated, filled a teacup with its contents and held it to the lady's lips. I'm better now, said Mrs. Coney, falling back after drinking half of it. Mr. Bumble raised his eyes piously to the ceiling in thankfulness, and bringing them down again to the brim of the cup, lifted it to his nose. Peppermint! Exclaimed Mrs. Corney in a faint voice, smiling gently on the beetle as she spoke. Try it. There's a little something out in it. Mr. Bumble tasted the medicine with a doubtful look, smacked his lips, took another taste, and put the cup down empty. It's very comforting, said Mrs. Corney. Very much so indeed, mum, said the beetle as he spoke. He drew a chair beside the matron and tenderly inquired what was happened to distress her. Nothing, replied Mrs. Corney. I am foolish, excitable, weak creature. Not weak, mum, retorted Mr. Bumble, getting his chair a little closer. Are you a weak creature, Mrs. Corney? We are all weak creatures, said Miss Corney, laying down the general principle. So we are, said the beetle. Nothing was said on either side for a minute or two afterwards but the expiration of that time. Mr. Bumble had illustrated his position by removing his left arm from the back of Mrs. Corney's chair, where it had previously rested, to Mrs. Corney's apron string, round which gradually became intertwined. We're all weak creatures, said Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Corney sighed. Don't soar, Mrs. Corney, said Mr. Bumble. I can't help it, said Mrs. Corney, and she sighed again. This is a very comfortable room, mum, said Mr. Bumble, looking around. Another room in this, mum, would be a complete thing.
It would be too much for one,
murmured the lady. But not for two, Mum, joined Mr. Bumble in soft accents. I'm Mrs. Corney. Mrs. Corney dropped her head when the beetle said this, and the beetle dropped his to get a view of Mrs. Corney's face. Mrs. Corney, with great propriety, turned her head away and released her hand to get at her pocket handkerchief, but insensibly replaced it in that of Mr. Bumble.
Your board allows you coast.
You boy allows you coast, don't I, Mrs. Corney? Inquired the beetle, affectionately pressing her hand.
And candles,
Replied Mrs. Corney, slightly returning the pressure. Coals and candles and house rent free, said Mr. Bumble. Oh, Mrs. Corney, what an angel you are. The lady was not proof against this burst of feeling. She sunk into Mr. Bumble's arms, and that gentleman, in his agitation, imprinted a passionate kiss upon her chaste nose. Such proloquial perfection, exclaimed Mr. Bumble rapturously. You know, Mrs. Sloughty's worst tea not my face at all. Okay, so I'm gonna take a quick break. We're just gonna. Hi, Fishy. Did you see my new video? I made a tribute to Kobe Bryant and his daughter Gigi. These are my new shoes. I love that. We definitely have some serious love for Kobe around here. So I will definitely be checking that out momentarily. Thanks for stopping by, Fishy. I'm sorry I'm kind of trying to do it more episodically tonight, so we're not going to be answering as many questions as quickly. And I'm already not the fastest to begin with it. But if you stick around, I might have some really interesting tidbits and things today between the chapters. So yes, replied Mrs. Corney bashfully. It can't every week, the doctor says, pursued Mr. Bumble. He's a master of this establishment. He therefore calls a vacancy, and that vacancy must be filled up. Oh, Mrs. Corney, what a prospect this opens. What an opportunity for joining a hearts and housekeepings. Mrs. Corney sobbed. The little word, said Mr. Bumble, bending over the bashful beauty. The one little word, my blessed Corney.
yes.
Sighed out the matron. One more, pursued the beetle. Compose your dying feelings for only one more. When is it to come off? Mrs. Corney twice essayed to speak, and twice failed. At length, summoning up courage, she threw her arms around Mr. Bumble's neck and said it might as soon be as ever he pleased, and that was an irresistible duck. Matters being thus amicably and satisfactorily arranged, the contract was solemn ratified in another teacup of the peppermint mixture, which was rendered the more necessary by the flutter and agitation of the lady's spirits. While it was being disposed of, she acquainted Mr. Bumble with the old woman's decease. Very good, said the gentleman, sipping his peppermint. I'll call his Sharpers when I go home and tell him to send tomorrow morning. Was it that as frightened you, love?
It wasn't anything particular, dear,
said the woman evasively. But it must be something, love, urged Mr. Bumble. Won't you tell us on your own, Bee?
Not now, rejoined the lady. One of these days after we're married, dear.
After we're married, exclaimed Mr. Bumble. It wasn't any impudence from any of them male porpoises.
No, love,
interposed the lady hastily. If I thought it was, continued Mr. Bumble, if I thought as any one of 'em had dared to lift his vulgar eyes to the lovely countenance.
They wouldn't have dared to do it, love,
responded the lady. They better not, said Mr. Bumble, clenching his fist. Let me see any man provoke or extra provoke as would presume to do it, and I can tell him that he wouldn't do it a second time. Unembellished by any violence of gesticulation, this might have seemed so very high a complaint to the lady's charms, but as Mr. Bumble accompanied the threat of many warlike gestures, she was much touched by it with this proof of his devotion, and protested with great admiration that he was indeed a dove. The dove then turned up his coat collar and put on his cocked hat, and having exchanged another long and affectionate embrace with his future partner, once again braved the cold wind of the night, merely pausing for a few minutes in the male pauper's ward to abuse them a little, with the view of satisfying himself that he could fill the office of workhouse master with needful acerbity. Assured of his qualifications, Mr. Bumble left the building with a light heart and bright visions of his future promotion, which served to occupy his mind until he reached the shop of the undertaker. Now Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry having gone out to tea and supper, and Noah Claypole not being at any time disposed to take upon himself a greater amount of physical exertion than is necessary to a convenient performance of the two functions of eating and drinking, the shop was not closed, although it was past the usual hour of shuttering up. Mr. Bumble tapped with his cane on the counter several times, but attracting no attention and beholding a light shining through the glass window of the little parlor at the back of the shop, he made bold to peep in and see what was going forward, and when he saw what was going forward, he was not a little surprised. Cloth was laid for supper, and the table was covered with bread and butter, plates and glasses, a porter pot, and a wine bottle. At the upper end of the table, Mr. Noah Claypole lolled negligently in an easy chair, with his legs thrown up over the arms, and an open clasp knife in the other hand, and a mass of buttered bread in the other. Close behind him stood Charlotte, opening oysters from a barrel, which Mr. Claypole condescended to swallow with remarkable avidity. A more than ordinary redness in the region of the young gentleman's nose, and a kind of fixed wink in his right eye, denoted that he was in a slight degree intoxicated, and these symptoms were confirmed by the intense relish with which he took his oysters, for which nothing but a strong appreciation of their cooling properties in case of an internal fever could have sufficiently accounted.
He's a delicious fat one down there,
said Charlotte.
Draw him to you, only this one.
Here's the picture that just popped up. Really love these illustrations. But that's supposed to be Charlotte and Noah, and Noah's supposed to be like a fat little drunk kid. So, what would you just sing, ye oyster? Replied Mr. Claypole after he had swallowed it. What a pity there's a number of them should ever make you feel uncomfortable, isn't it, Charlotte?
It's quite a cruelty,
said Charlotte. So it is, acquiesced Mr. Claypole.
Ain't you fond of oysters? Not over much,
replied Charlotte.
Well, I can see you eat them now, dear, but I ain't eating them myself.
Yo, said Noah reflectively.
How queer. Have another,
said Charlotte.
Here's one with such a beautiful, delicate beard.
I can't manage any more, said Noah. I'm very sorry. Come here, Charlotte, and I'll kiss you.
What?
said Mr. Bumble, busting into the room.
Say that again, sir.
Charlotte uttered a scream and hid her face in her apron. Mr. Claypole, without making any further change in his position than suffering his legs to reach the ground, gazed at the beetle in drunken terror.
Say it again, you oasis fellow,
said Mr. Bumble.
How dare you mention such a thing, sir? How dare you encourage him, you insolent mix?
Kiss her? Exclaimed Mr. Bumble in strong indignation.
Faugh!
What do you mean to do it? Said Noah, blubbering.
She's always kissing at me whether I like it or not.
Oh, Noah, cried Charlotte reproachfully.
Ye are, you know ye are.
retorted Noah.
She's always doing it, Mr. Bumble, sir. She chucks me under the chin, please, sir, and makes all manner of
Silence!
cried Mr. Bumble sternly.
Take yourself downstairs, Mum. Noah, you shut up the shop. Say another word till your master comes home at your peril. And when he does come home, tell him Mr. Bumble said he was to send the old woman's shell after the breakfast tomorrow morning. Do you hear, sir? Kissing,
cried Mr. Bumble, holding up his hands.
the sinning wickedness of the lower orders in this parochial district is frightful. If Parliament don't take their abominable courses under consideration, this country is ruined, and the character of the peasantry is gone forever.
With these words, the beetle strode with a lofty and gloomy air from the undertaker's premises. And now that we have accompanied him so far as the road home and made all necessary preparations for the old woman's funeral, let us set foot a few inquiries of young Oliver Twist and ascertain whether he be still lying in a ditch where Toby Crackit left him. So GOAT means greatest of all time. We're on chapter 28, looks after Oliver and proceeds with his adventures. So we definitely made a point of at least finding out that Oliver's still doing all right, which I don't know. I feel like it wouldn't have been good writing to have this much of the book left and kill off the main character. But so I guess there's a couple things I want to show everybody. For starters, there is a really big case going on in California right now that a lot of people don't know about. It is 19 CV 2407 CAB AHG. But the thing about 19 CV2407 CAB AHG is just exactly what it is about. I'm going to give you just a second to see if you can read that. If not, it's okay, because I'll read it for you. This is the United States District Court of Southern California. The AI Organization Incorporated, Cyrus A. Parsa, victims of persecution, rape, torture, concentration camps, sex, human and organ trafficking, and organ harvesting in China, Hong Kong, America, and around the world, not limited to democracy activists, Falun Dafa practitioners, Uyghur Muslims, Christians, Tibetans, judges, lawyers, and journalists tortured and killed in China, John Doe's 1 through Unlimited plaintiffs versus Google LLC, Facebook Incorporated, DeepMind Incorporated, Alphabet Incorporated, Neuralink Incorporated, Tesla Incorporated, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, Sundar Pichai, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Cizan PR Newswire, and John Doe's 1 through 29 defendants. Complaint: misuse of artificial intelligence, cybernetics, robotics, bioengineering, 5G, and quantum computing technology. 2. Endangering the human race with the misuse of artificial intelligence technology. 3. Transfer of AI weapon technology to China. 4. Complicity in genocide, China. 5. Violation of Article 1 Genocide Convention. 6. Violation of Article 2 Genocide Convention. 7. Violation of Article 3 Genocide Convention. So basically, there's a huge court case where they're trying to make all of these tech companies. One more time, I want to show you that I'm reading from something that's real here. There's an actual court document. So hopefully this doesn't get deleted, because basically all of the major tech companies have been going around China, just letting them do whatever for a couple extra dollars. And even though everyone eventually ends up getting screwed by the Chinese government, they still kind of feel like if they work with them, it's better to get a couple dollars now than worry about it. Yeah, my dogs are always barking. They're awesome, though. But basically, the Chinese Communist Party is really bad about harvesting people's organs and basically trying to treat their entire country like a giant prison camp. And all these tech companies have just been working with them this whole time for, like, even though they know they're going to get screwed, just because there's so many people in China and they don't want to completely miss out on that market. So they're being really complacent in everything that China wants them to do. Top that off with them actually trying to experiment with new different technologies in the American spectrum of things in the US. And, it's really a wonderful thing that we have this lawsuit here, because they might be able to put a stop to these people. Funny thing about it, it was filed on December 16th, 2019. So I think anytime that people start associating China with the genocide that they've actually caused, stuff tends to go awry, and we're not really allowed to see that on a large scale. But that's just another thing that you got to understand, is that you cannot trust any of these major businesses, and you do have to unplug yourself from this technology for at least a few hours every day. Meditate, eat healthy, try and find ways around just the world that we live in. And most importantly, think for yourself. Draw your own conclusions, do your own research. If you search the case number that I left in the chat, you will definitely be able to pull up the full information about that. So, bork, bork, bork. Let me get back into chapter 28. Looks after Oliver, then proceeds with his adventures.
Wolves tear your throat,
Muttered Sykes, grinding his teeth.
always, always among some of you. You house your horse, your voice.
Sykes growled forth this imprecation with the most desperate ferocity that his desperate nature was capable of. He rested the body of the wounded boy across his bended knee and turned his head for an instant to look back at the pursuers. There was little to be made out in the mist and darkness, but the loud shouting of men vibrated through the air, and the barking of neighboring dogs rose by the sound of the alarm bell, resounded in every direction.
Stop you, you hound,
cried the robber, shouting after Toby Crackit, who made his best use of his long legs and was already ahead.
Stop!
The repetition of the word brought Toby to a dead standstill, for he was not quite satisfied that he was beyond the range of pistol shot, and Sykes was in no mood to be played with.
Better hand with the boy,
roared Sykes, beckoning furiously to his confederate.
Come back.
Toby made a show of returning, but ventured, in a low voice broken for want of breath, to imitate considerable reluctance as he came slowly along.
Quicker!
cried Sykes, laying the boy in a dry ditch at his feet and drawing a pistol from his pocket.
Don't play bitty with me.
At this moment the noise grew louder. Sikes, again looking around, could discern that the men who had given chase were already climbing the gate of the field in which he stood, and that a couple of dogs were some paces in advance of him.
Ease up, Bill.
Cried Toby.
Drop the kid and show him your heels.
With this parting advice, Mr. Crackit preferred the chance of being shot by his friend to the uncertainty of being taken by his enemies, fairly turned tail, and darted off at full speed. Sikes clenched his teeth, took one look round, threw over the prostrate form of Oliver the cape in which he had been hurriedly muffled, ran along the front of the hedge as to distract the attention of those behind from the spot where the boy lay, paused for a second before another hedge which met at its right angles, and whirling his pistol so high in the air, cleared it at a bound and was gone.
Ho! Ho there! Cried a tremulous voice in the rear. Pincher! Neptune! Come here! Come here!
The dogs, who in common with their masters seemed to have no particular relish for the sport in which they were engaged, readily answered to the command, and 3 men who had by this time advanced some distance to the field stopped to take counsel together.
My advice on this
My advice on this is, I should say my orders is,
said the fattest man of the party,
that we immediately go home again. I'm agreeing to anything which is agreeable, Mr. Giles,
said a shorter man who was by no means of a slim figure, and who was very pale in the face and very polite, as frightened men frequently are.
And we shouldn't wish it to appear ill-mannered, gentlemen,
said the third, who had called the dogs back.
Mr. Giles ought to know.
Certainly, cried the shorter man.
Whatever Mr. Giles says, it isn't our place to contradiction. No, I know City Wotton. Thank my stars, I know my City Wotton.
To tell the truth, the little man did seem to know his situation, and to know it perfectly well that it was by no means a desirable one, for his teeth chattered in his head as he spoke.
You're afraid, Bristles,
said Mr. Giles.
I ain't,
said Brittles.
Yes, you are,
said Giles.
You're a falsehood, Mr. Giles,
said Brittles.
You're a lie, Brittles,
said Mr. Giles. Now these 4 retorts arose from Mr. Giles's taunt, and Mr. Giles's taunt had arisen from his indignation at having the responsibility of going home again imposed upon himself under a cover of compliment. The third man brought the dispute to a close, most philosophically.
Hey, dear, you what, gentlemen, he said, we're all afraid. Speak for yourself, sir,
said Mr. Giles, who was the palest of the party.
So do I, replied the man. It is natural and proper to be afraid under such circumstances. I am. So am I, said Brittles. Only there's no call to tell a man he is so bountiful.
These frank admissions softened Mr. Giles, who at once owned that he was afraid, upon which they all 3 faced about and ran back again with the completest unanimity until Mr. Giles, who had in the shortest wind of the party and was encumbered with a pitchfork, most handsomely insisted on stopping to make an apology for his hastiness of speech.
But it's wonderful,
Mr. Giles, when he explained.
What a man will do when his blood is up. I should have committed murder, but I should, if we'd caught one of the rascals.
As the 2 were impressed with a similar present, and as their blood, like his, had all gone down again, some speculation ensued upon the cause of this sudden change in their temperament.
I should know what it is,
said Mr. Giles.
It was the gate. "I shouldn't wonder if it was,"
exclaimed Brittles, catching at the idea.
"You may depend upon it."
Said Giles.
At the gate stopped at the flow of excitement. I felt your mind suddenly going away as I was climbing over it.
By a remarkable coincidence, the other two had been visited with a similar unpleasant sensation at that precise moment. It was quite obvious, therefore, that at the gate, especially as there was no doubt regarding the time at which the change had taken place, because all three remembered that they had come in sight of the robbers at the very instant of its occurrence. This dialogue was held between the two men who had surprised the burglars and a traveling tinker who had been sleeping in an outhouse and who had been roused together with two mongrel curs in joint of the pursuit. Mr. Giles acted in double capacity of the butler and steward to the old lady of the mansion, and Brittles was laid of all work, who, having entered her service a mere child, was treated as a promising young boy still, though he was something past 30. Encouraging each other with such converse as this, but keeping very close together notwithstanding, and looking apprehensively round whether a fresh gust rattled through the boughs, the two men hurried back to a tree, behind which they had left their lantern, lest its light should inform the thieves of what direction to fire. Catching up to the light, they made the best of their way home at a good round trot, and not long after their dusky forms had ceased to be discernible, it might have been seen twinkling and dancing in the distance, like some exhalation of the damp and gloomy atmosphere through which it was swiftly borne. The air grew colder as the day came slowly on, and the mist rolled along the ground like a dense cloud of smoke. The grass was wet, parchways and low places were all mire and water, and the deep breath of an unwholesome wind went languidly by with a hollow moaning. Still Oliver lay motionless and insensible on the spot where Sikes had left him. Morning drew on apace. The air became more sharp and piercing, as its first dull dew, the death of night rather than the birth of day, glimmered faintly in the sky. The objects which had looked dim and terrible in the darkness grew more and more defined, and gradually resolved into their familiar shapes. Rain came down thick and fast, and pattered noisily among the leafless bushes, but Oliver felt it not as it beat against him, for he still lay stretched, helpless and unconscious, on his bed of clay. At length a low cry of pain broke his stillness that prevailed, and uttering it, the boy awoke. His left arm, rudely bandaged in a shawl, hung heavy and useless at his side, and the bandage was saturated with blood. He was so weak that he could scarcely raise himself into a sitting posture, and when he had done so, he looked feebly around for help and groaned with pain. Trembling in every joint from cold and exhaustion, he made an effort to stand upright, but shuddering from head to foot, fell prostrate on the ground. After a short return of the stupor in which he had been so long plunged, Oliver, urged by a creeping sickness at his heart, which seemed to warn him that if he lay there he must surely die, got upon his feet and essayed to walk. His head was dizzy, and he staggered to and fro like a drunken man, but he kept up nevertheless, and with his head drooping languidly on his breast, went stumbling onward, he knew not whither. And now hosts of bewildering and confusing ideas came crowding on his mind. He still seemed to be walking between Sikes and Crackit, who were angrily disputing, for the very words they said sounded in his ears, when he caught his own attention, as it were, by making some violent effort to save himself from falling. He found that he was talking to them. Then he was alone with Sikes, plodding on as they had done the previous day, and as shadowy people passed him, he felt the robber's grasp upon his wrist. Suddenly he started back at the report of firearms, and there rose in the air loud cries and shouts. Lights gleamed before his eyes, and all was noise and tumult, as some unseen hand bore him hurriedly away. Through all these rapid visions there ran an undefined, uneasy consciousness of pain, which wearied and tormented him incessantly. I'm going to write something real quick. There, that actually is pretty dope. Now let me just add some quotations. Yeah, I think it's funny because, like, a lot of times when you say anything that goes against the government, you're automatically a conspiracy theorist. But when you point out something that there is actually evidence to that you know is not any type of theory because it's a proven fact, they still try to play you off as a conspiracy theorist. There are still people who don't know that a lot of crazy stuff has happened. So we'll get into that next chapter break. But remember that case in Southern California right now, 19 CV 2407 CAB AHG, probably is going to be like the most important court case of our lifetimes, and that's probably why we haven't heard about it at all. But anyway, thus he staggered on, creeping almost mechanically between the bars of gates or through hedge gaps as they came in his way, until he reached a road. Here the rain began to fall so heavily that it roused him. He looked about and saw that at no great distance there was a house, which perhaps he could reach. Pitying his condition, they might have compassion on him, and if they did not, it would be better, he thought, to die near human beings than in lonely open fields. He summoned up all of his strength for one last trial, and bent his faltering steps towards it. As he drew near to the house, a feeling came over him that he had seen it before. He remembered nothing of its details, but the shape and aspect of the building seemed familiar to him. That garden wall, on the grass inside, he had fallen on his knees last night and prayed the two men's mercy. It was the very same house they had attempted to rob. Oliver felt such fear come over him when he recognized the place that for an instant he forgot the agony of his wound and thought of only flight. Flight. He could scarcely stand, and if he were in full possession of his best powers of a slight and youthful frame, whither he could fly. He pushed against the garden gate. It was unlocked and swung on its hinges. He tottered across the lawn, stumbling the steps, knocked faintly at the door, and his whole strength failing him, sunk down against one of the pillars of the little portico. It happened about that time that Mr. Giles, Brittles, and the tinker were recruiting themselves after the fatigues and terrors of the night with tea and sundries in the kitchens, that it was Mr. Giles's habit to admit to great familiarity the humbler servants, towards whom the cook and housemaid, who were of the party, listened with breathless interest.
"It was about 2:30,
said Mr. Giles,
or I wouldn't swear that it mightn't have been a little nearer 3 when I woke up, and turning round in my bed as it might be so."
Here Mr. Giles turned round in his chair and pulled the corner of the tablecloth over to him to imitate bedclothes.
"I fancied I heard a noise."
At this point of the narrative, the cook turned pale and asked the housemaid to shut the door, who asked Brittles, who asked the tinker, who pretended not to hear.
"Heard a noise," continued Mr. Giles. "I seized at first this illusion, and was composing myself to sleep when I heard the noise again, distinct.
What sort of noise? Asked the cook.
A kind of bustling noise, replied Mr. Giles, looking round him, but more like the noise of powdering an iron bar on a nutmeg gritter,
suggested Mr. Brittles.
It is when you heard, sir, rejoined Mr. Giles, but at this time it had a busting sound. I turned down the clothes,
continued Giles, rolling back at the tablecloth.
Sat up in bed and listened.
The cook and housemaid simultaneously ejaculated, "Yaw!" and they drew their chairs closer together.
I heard it now, quite apparent,
resumed Mr. Giles.
Somebody, I says, I heard it now, kind of apparent. Somebody, I says, is forcing of a door or a window, so what's to be done? I climb up to the poor lad, Brittles, and save him from being murdered in his bed, or of his throat. I says I may cut his left ear or his right without his ever knowing it.
All eyes turned upon Brittles, who fixed upon the speaker and stared at him with his mouth wide open, with a face expressive of the most unmitigated horror.
I tossed off the clothes,
said Giles, throwing away the tablecloth and looking very hard at the cook and housemaid.
Get softly out of bed, drew on a pair of
ladies present, Mr. Giles, murmured the tinker.
Of shoes, sir,
said Giles, turning upon him and laying great emphasis on the word.
Seized and loaded a pistol that always goes up the stairs with the plate basket, and walked on tiptoes to his room. Brittles, I says when I woke him up, don't be frightened.
So you did, observed Brittles in a low voice.
We're dead men, I think, Brittles, I says,
continued Giles.
But don't be frightened.
Was he frightened? Asked the cook.
Not a bit of it,
replied Mr. Giles.
He was pretty near firm as I was.
I should have died at once, I'm sure, if it had been me,
observed the housemaid.
You're a woman,
retorted Brittles, picking up a little.
Brittles is right,
said Mr. Giles, nodding his head approvingly.
From a woman nothing else is to be expected, but we being men took a dark lantern, and that was standing on Brittles' hob, groped our way down the stairs in the pitch dark, as it might be so.
Mr. Giles had risen out of the seat and taken 2 steps with his eyes shut to accompany his description with appropriate action, when he started violently in common with the rest of the company and hurried back to his chair. The cook and housemaid screamed.
It was a knock,
said Mr. Giles, assuming perfect serenity.
Open the door, somebody.
Nobody moved. It seems a strange sort of thing, and not coming at such a time.
It seems a strange sort of thing, and not coming at such a time in the morning,
said Mr. Giles, surveying the pale faces which surrounded him, and looking very blankly himself.
But the door must be open. Do you hear somebody?
Mr. Giles, as he spoke, looked at Brittles, but that young man, being naturally modest, probably considered himself nobody, so held that the inquiry could not have been any application to him. In all events, he tendered no reply.
Oh, Mr. Giles.
Mr. Giles directing an appealing glance at the tinkler, but he had suddenly fallen asleep. The women were out of the question.
If Brittles would open the door in the presence of witnesses,
said Mr. Giles at a short silence,
I am ready to make one. So am I,
said the tinker, waking up as suddenly as falling asleep. Brittles capitulated on these terms, and the party, being somewhat reassured by the discovery made on throwing open the shutters, that it was now broad day, took their way upstairs with the dogs in front, and the 2 women who were afraid to stay below, bringing up the rear. By advice of Mr. Giles, they all talked very loud to warn any evil disposed person outside that they were very strong in numbers, and by a master stroke of policy originating in the brain of the same ingenious gentleman, the dogs' tails were well pinched in the hall to make them bark savagely. These precautions having been taken, Mr. Giles held on fast by the tinker's arm to prevent his running away, as he pleasantly said, and gave word of command to open the door. Brittles obeyed, and the group, peeping timorously over each other's shoulders, beheld no more formidable object than poor little Oliver Twist, speechless and exhausted, who raised his heavy eyes and mutely solicited their compassion.
Boy!"
Exclaimed Mr. Giles, valiantly pushing the tinker into the background.
"What's the matter with Why, Brittles, look at ya! Don't you know?"
Brittles, who had got behind the door to open it, no sooner saw Oliver than he uttered a loud cry. Mr. Giles, seizing the boy by one leg and one arm, fortunately not the broken limb, lugged him straight into the hall and deposited him at full length on the floor.
"There he is!"
bawled Giles, calling in a state of great excitement up the staircase.
"He's one of the thieves, mum. Here's the thief, miss. Wounded, miss. I shot him, miss, and Brittles had the light." "In a lantern, miss,"
cried Biddles, applying one hand to the side of his mouth so that his voice might travel better. The two women servants ran upstairs to carry the intelligence that Mr. Giles had captured a robber, and the tinker busied himself with endeavoring to restore Oliver, lest he die before he could be hanged. In the midst of all this noise and commotion, there was heard a sweet female voice, which quelled it in an instant. "Giles," whispered the voice from a stairhead. Here's your illustration.
"I'm here, miss,"
replied Mr. Giles.
"Don't be frightened, miss. I ain't much injured. Or did it make a very desperate resistance, miss? I soon too many for him."
"Hush," replied the young lady. "You frightened my aunt as much as the thieves did. Is this poor creature hurt?"
"Wounded desperate, miss,"
replied Giles with indescribable complacency. "He looks as if he was going." "Oh,
"He looks as if he was going, miss,"
bawled Brittles in the same manner as before.
"Wouldn't you like to come back and look at him, miss, in case he should?"
"Hush, pray, there's a good man," rejoined the young lady. "Wait quietly one instant while I speak to aunt." With footsteps as soft and gentle as the voice, the speaker tripped away and soon returned with the direction that the wounded person was to be carried carefully upstairs to Mr. Giles's room, and that Brittles was to saddle the pony and betake himself instantly to Chertsey, from which place he was to dispatch with all speed a constable and a doctor.
"But won't you take one look at him first, miss?"
asked Mr. Giles with as much pride as if Oliver was some kind of bird or rare plumage that he had so skillfully brought down.
"Not one little peep, miss."
"Not now for the world," replied the young lady. "Poor fellow! Oh, treat him kindly, Giles, for my sake." The servant looked up at the speaker as she turned away with a glance as proud and admiring as she had been of her own child. Then, bending over Oliver, he helped to carry him upstairs in the care and solicitude of a woman. And now we're on chapter 29, page 216, has an introductory account of the inmates of the house to which Oliver restored. Okay. So yeah, we're gonna leave that right there. But yeah, we were kind of briefly talking about conspiracy theories. So like, there's a lot of stuff that has come into light because, after so many years, with most things, the government will release detailed information about it. We don't really have like the bureaucracy or republic that everyone thinks we do. It's more like a bureaucratic oligarchy. So like they do actually have really well defined systems in place, and we can use them to our advantage. We can really do quite a bit in society. But one thing though is that a lot of stuff that people thought were conspiracy theories back in the day ended up being right. So, like, for example, the Gulf of Tonkin incident that incited the Vietnam War was really just overhyped because they just wanted a means to get into war. So everyone who told all the protesters that they were conspiracy theorists when the war was going around, they were wrong, not the protesters. Then there is the MK Ultra mind control program, which actually did exist, consisted of a ton of various testing on different individuals, usually against their will, with things like LSD and different psychoactive drugs involved. Another one that a lot of people don't know about, the Tuskegee experiments. Yeah, they were intentionally infecting poor people in the South with various infectious diseases, including syphilis, from like the 30s all the way up until the 70s under Nixon. 10 years later, AIDS became a thing. And AIDS is one of them that it needed some time to incubate in people before it really started coming to the forefront. So take of that what you will, but they were really intentionally trying to use poor black people in those experiments. And it lasted like 40 years before they finally stepped in and put an end to it. So yeah, conspiracy theories. If you guys come up with anything else and you want to discuss it, I'm happy to discuss it. But one more time before I get back into chapter 29, which is just beginning for the record, 19 CV 2407 CAB AHG. Really important that you guys remember this court case. It's going to make a huge difference in the world if this court case happens. I'm just going to check one thing and dive back into this. So, 2 seconds. Like I said, really just let me know if you guys can come up with anything else really worth talking about. But yeah, I just think it's insane that we know about so many of these theories nowadays. Absolutely wild. And this is really another thing that I love about this Oliver Twist book is that we have the ability to actually, discuss different things that are going on in the world from the guise of comedy, because comedy is the best social commentary. Comedy is ridiculously good social commentary. So that's something I love about this book and a lot of others that are like it, is that the books that make you laugh when you are not supposed to are the books that have the most truth in them. So I definitely recommend Catch-22 for people who haven't read it before. A lot of that stuff that's like right there at the surface, it's just so true and it rings so true today. And this book right here, Oliver Twist, I think my favorite thing about it is just the fact that It really shows you what happens when you disenfranchise whole communities of people in your society. There's only one group of people that I'm really seeking to piss off. And I'm not trying to piss them off too bad, because most people who piss them off too bad. Chapter 29 has an introductory account of the inmates of the house to which Oliver restored. In a handsome room, through its furniture had rather the air of old-fashioned comfort than of modern elegance, there sat two ladies at a well-spread breakfast table. Mr. Giles, dressed with scrupulous care in full black suit, was in attendance upon them. He had taken his station some halfway between the sideboard and the breakfast table, and with his body drawn up to its full height, his head thrown back and inclined to the nearest trifle on one side, his leg advanced, and his right hand thrust into his waistcoat, while his left hung down by his side grasping a waiter, looked like one who had labored under a very agreeable sense of his own merits and importance. Oh boy. Of the two ladies, one was well advanced in years, but the high-backed oaken chair in which she sat was not more upright than she. Dressed with the utmost nicety and precision in a quaint mixture of bygone costume, with some slight concessions to the prevailing taste, which rather served to point the old style pleasantly than to impair its effect, she sat in a stately manner, with her hands folded on the table before her. Her eyes, and age had dimmed but little of their brightness, were fixed attentively upon her young companion. The younger lady was in lovely bloom, and the springtime of womanhood, at that age when, if ever angels be for God's good purposes enthroned in mortal forms, they may be, without impiety, supposed to abide in such as hers. She was not past 17, cast in so slight and exquisite a mold, so mild and gentle, so pure and beautiful, that earth seemed not her element, nor its rough creatures her fit companions. The very intelligence that shone in her deep blue eyes, and was stamped upon her noble head, seemed scarcely of her age or of the world, and yet the changing expression of sweetness and good humor, the thousand lights that played about her face and left no shadow there, and above all the smile, the cheerful, happy smile, were made for home, for fireside, for peace and happiness. She was busily engaged in the little offices of the table, chancing to raise her eyes as the elder lady was regarding her. She playfully put back her hair, which was simply braided on her forehead, and threw into one beaming look such a gush of affection and artless loveliness that blessed spirits might have smiled to look upon her. As Brittles had begun upwards of an hour.
Oh, and Brittles has been gone upwards of an hour, has he?
Asked the old lady after a pause.
No, in 12... an hour and 12 minutes, ma'am,
replied Mr. Giles, referring to a silver watch which he drew forth back rimmet.
He's always slow,
remarked the old lady.
Brittles was a slow boy, ma'am,
replied the attendant, and seeing by the by that Brittles had been slow boy for upwards of 30 years, there appeared no great probability of his ever being a fast one.
He gets worse instead of better, I think, said the elder lady.
It is very inexcusable in him if he stops to play with any other boys,
said the young lady, smiling. Mr. Giles was apparently considering the propriety of indulging a respectful smile himself, when a gig drove up to the garden gate, out of which there jumped a fat gentleman, who ran straight up to the door, and who, quickly getting into the house by some mysterious process, burst into the room and nearly overturned Mr. Giles at the breakfast table together.
"I've never heard of such a thing,"
exclaimed the fat gentleman.
My dear Mrs. Mary, bless my soul, in the silence of night too, I will never hear of such a thing.
With these expressions of condolence, the fat gentleman shook hands with both ladies, and drawing upon a chair, inquired how they found themselves.
You ought to be dead, positively dead with fright,
Said the fat gentleman.
Why didn't you send? Bless me, my man should have come in a minute, and so would I, and my assistant would have been delighted, or anybody, I'm sure, under such circumstances, dear. So expected in such silence of the
Oh, excuse me, I got the hiccups. But
so unexpected in the silence of night too.
the doctor seemed especially troubled by the fact of the robbery having been unexpected and attempted in the nighttime, as if it were established custom of gentlemen in the housebreaking way to transact business at noon and to make an appointment by 2-penny post a day or two previous.
And you, Mrs. Rose,
Said the doctor, turning to the young lady.
Oh, very much indeed.
Said Mrs. Rose, interrupting him.
There is a poor creature upstairs whom Aunt wishes you to see.
oh, to be so,
Replied the doctor.
so there is. That was your handiwork, girls, I understand.
Mr. Giles, who had been feverishly putting the teacups to rights, blushed very red, and said that he had that honor.
Honor, eh?
Said the doctor.
Well, I don't know. Perhaps it is honorable to hit a thief in the back kitchen as to hit your man at 12 places. Fancy that you fire in the air, and you fought a duel, Mr. Giles.
Mr. Giles, who thought this light treatment of the matter an unjust attempt at diminishing his glory, answered respectfully that it was not for him to judge about that, but rather he thought it was to joke at the opposite party.
Glad that's true.
So the doctor,
Where is she? Show me the way. I'll look in again as I come down, Miss Bailey. That's the little window that he got in there, but I couldn't have believed it.
talking all the way, he followed Mr. Giles up the stairs, and while he is going upstairs, the reader may be informed that Mr. Lobsburn, a surgeon in the neighborhood, known through a circuit of 10 miles round as the doctor, had grown fat, more from good humor than from good living, and he was kind and hearty, and withal as eccentric an old bachelor as he will be found in 5 times that space by any explorer alive. The doctor was absent much longer than he or the ladies had anticipated. A large box was fetched out of the gig, and a bedroom bell was rung very often, and the servants ran up and down stairs perpetually, from which tokens it justly concluded that something important was going on above. At length he returned, and in no reply to an anxious inquiry after his patient, looked very mysteriously and closed the door carefully.
This is a very extraordinary thing, Miss Bailey,
Said the doctor, standing with his back to the door as if to keep it shut.
He's not in danger, I hope,
Said the old lady.
Why, that would not be an extraordinary thing under these circumstances,
Replied the doctor.
though I don't think he is. Have you seen this thief?
No,
Rejoined the old lady.
Nor heard anything about him?
no.
I beg your pardon, man.
Interposed Mr. Giles.
I beg your pardon, ma'am,
Interposed Mr. Giles.
but I was going to tell him about when Dr. Lobson came in.
The fact was that Mr. Giles had not at first been able to bring his mind to the avowal that he only shot a boy. Such commendations had bestowed upon his bravery that he could not, for the life of him, help postponing the explanation of a few delicious minutes during which he Haley,
But I wouldn't hear of it.
Harumph!
rejoined the doctor.
There is nothing very alarming in his appearance. Have you any objection to see him in my presence?
If it be necessary,
replied the old lady.
certainly not.
Then I think it is necessary.
Said the doctor.
At all events, I am quite sure that you will deeply regret not having done so, if you postponed it. It is perfectly quiet and comfortable now. Allow me, Miss Rose, will you permit me? Not the slightest fear. I pledge you my honor.
And that is chapter 29, which brings us to chapter 30. Relates to what Oliver's new visitors thought of him. So I'm going to kind of skip ahead and just see. Well, that's not a very long chapter either. Not a big fan of these guys' voices. I just keep like haphazardly trying to come up with voices. I guess we will read chapter 30 real quick. And then we will cut it off at chapter 31. Just to give you guys 4 chapters tonight instead of 3. Meant what I said before too about the whole oligarchy thing. That's really the form of government that we have, because there's really only a few people who get to control who we really end up being able to vote for, at least for any positions of serious power. Now, as far as being like local stuff, you usually do actually get some pretty good say when it comes to local elections. But you know, when it's these national things, you're really just choosing between 2 people who've been decided upon by the same group of people at the top. You know, the top of the socioeconomic ladder. So Biden and Trump are basically going to do the same stuff if they get elected. The main difference is that Trump's always going to be more of a vocal dick about it. And Trump is always going to be more scrutinized for that reason, usually, but not always. There have been some stuff that he's done that's been like borderline dictatorial. And I don't even know if our oligarchs are a fan of that. But no matter how you play it, it's really hard to win one for us as ordinary people. Because we're one of the less democratic societies anymore, even though we are one of the oldest surviving democracies, with the only really notable longer democracy being Iceland. Iceland has never really been reverted into a quasi-oligarch, a quasi-oligarchic state like we are. So it's like weird, because it's like the bureaucracy is like designed to work against us, but if you can work with it, these people at least have a few means to balance each other out. So again, biggest court case of our day is in the Southern District of California, 19 CV 2407 CABAHG. Hugely important. And you probably don't want to, it should really be shared, honestly. It just needs to be heard of. They test a lot of stuff without our knowing it, and they've done way too much in these tech companies for the glorious People's Republic of China. So, chapter 30, getting back into this, relates what Oliver's new visitors thought of him. Any questions, comments? I will get to them eventually, so just drop them in there. But with many loquacious assurances that they would be agreeably surprised in the aspect of the criminal, the doctor drew the young lady's arm through one of his, offering his disengaged hand to Mrs. Maylie, then, with much ceremony and stateliness, upstairs.
No,
said the doctor in a whisper as he softly turned the handle, held the curtain in his hand, and looked on for a minute or so in silence. Whilst he was watching his patient thus, a younger lady glided softly past, and seating herself in a chair by the bedside, gathered Oliver's hair from his face. As she stopped over him, her tears fell upon his forehead. The boy stirred and smiled in his sleep, as though these marks of pity and compassion had awakened some pleasant dream of love and affection that he had never known, as a strain of gentle music or rippling of water in a silent place, or the odor of a flower, or even the mention of a familiar word will sometimes call up sudden dim remembrances of scenes that never were in this life, which vanished like a breath, and which some brief memory of a happier existence long gone by would have seemed awakened, for no voluntary exertion of the mind can ever recall them.
What does this mean?
Exclaimed the elder lady.
This poor child can never have been the pupil of robbers.
Voice, said the surgeon, replacing the curtain.
takes up the bed and many temples, and who can say that a fellow outside shall not enshrine her?
But at such an early age, urged Rose.
But a young lady,
rejoined the surgeon, mournfully shaking his head.
Crime like death is not confined to the old and withered alone, but the youngest and fairest are too often its chosen victims.
But can you, oh sir, can you really believe that this delicate boy has been a nefarious associate with the worst outcasts of society?
Said Rose. The surgeon shook his head in a manner which imitated that he feared it was very possible, and observing that they might disturb the patient, led way to an adjoining apartment.
But even if he has been wicked,
pursued Rose,
think of how young he is. Think that he may never have known a mother's love, or the comfort of the home, or that ill usage and blows, or the want of bread, may have driven him to herd with men who have forced him to guilt. Aunt, dear aunt, for mercy's sake, think of this before you let them drag this sick child to prison, which in any case must be the grave of all chances of amendment. Oh, as you love me and know that I have never felt the want of parents on your goodness and affection, but that I might have done so, and might have been equally helpless and unprotected as this poor child, I have pity upon him, or it is too late. My dear love,
said the elderly lady as she folded the weeping girl to her bosom.
Do you really think I would harm a hair on his head? Oh, no,
replied Rose eagerly.
No,
said the old lady with a trembling lip.
My days are drawing to their close, and may mercy be shown to me as I show it to others. What can I think to do? What can I do to save him, sir?
Let me think, Mum, said the doctor. Let me think.
Mr. Losberne thrust his hands into his pockets and took several turns up and down the room, often stopping and balancing himself on his toes and frowning frightfully. After various exclamations of
I've got it now, and no, I haven't,
and as many renewals of walking and frowning, he at length made a dead halt and spoke as follows.
I think if you give me a full and unlimited commission to bury Giles, that the little boy Brittles, I can manage it. He is a faithful fellow and an old servant, I know, but you can make up to him in 1,000 ways and reward him for being such a good cook besides. You don't object to that.
Unless there is some other way of preserving the child,
replied Mrs. Maylie.
There is no other,
said the doctor.
No other, take my word for it.
Then
that my aunt invests you with full power.
said Rose, smiling through her tears.
But pray don't be harder upon the poor fellows than is indispensably necessary.
You seem to think
Retorted the doctor.
that everybody is disposed to be hard-hearted today except yourself, Miss Rose. Only hope for the sake of the rising male sex generally, that you may be found in this venerable and soft-hearted mood by the first eligible young fellow who appeals to your compassion. And I wish I were a young fellow that I may avail myself on the spot of such a favourable opportunity doing so as the present.
You're as great a boy as poor Brittles himself.
Returned Rose, blushing.
Oh, excuse me.
No,
Said the doctor, laughing heartily.
but is no different. But when we return to this boy, the great point of our argument is yet to come. He will wake in an hour or so, I dare say, and although I have thought that thick-headed constable fellow downstairs that mustn't be moved or spoken to on peril of his life, I think we may cease with him without danger. Now, I make this stipulation, that I shall examine him in your presence, and that if from what he says we judge, I can show to the satisfaction of your cool reasons that he is a real and thorough Breton, which is more than possible. He shall be left to his fate without any further interference at my part, at all events.
Oh, no, aunt.
Entreated Rose.
Yes, aunt,
Said the doctor.
is it a bargain?
He cannot be hard in advice.
Said Rose.
'Tis impossible.
Very good,
Reported the doctor.
and so much the more reason for acceding to my proposition.
Finally, the treaty was entered into, and the parties thereunto sat down to wait with some impatience until Oliver should awake. The presence of the two ladies was destined to undergo a longer trial. The Mr. Lar passed on, and still Oliver slumbered heavily. It was evening, indeed, before the kind-hearted doctor brought them the intelligence that he said, and weak from the loss of blood, but his mind was so troubled with anxiety to close something that he deemed it better to give him the opportunity than to insist upon remaining quiet until the next morning, that he should otherwise have done. Their conference was a long one, for Oliver told them all his simple history, and was often compelled to stop by pain and want of strength. It was a solemn thing to hear. Excuse me. In the darkened room, the feeble voice of the sick child recounting a weary catalogue of evils and calamities which hard men had brought upon him. Oh, if when we oppress and grind our fellow creatures, we bestow but one thought on the dark evidences of human error, which like dense and heavy clouds, arising slowly it is true, but not less surely to heaven, to pour their after vengeance on our heads, if we heard but one instant in imagination the deep testimony of dead men's voices, which no power can stifle and no pride shut out. Where would be the injury and injustice, the suffering, misery, cruelty, and wrong that each day's life brings with it? Oliver's pillow was smoothed by gentle hands that night, and loveliness and virtue watched him while he slept. He felt calm and happy, and could have died without a murmur. The momentous interview was no sooner concluded and Oliver composed to rest again than the doctor, after weeping his eyes and condemning them for being weak all at once. He took himself downstairs to open upon Mr. Giles, and finding nobody about the parlors, it occurred to him that he could perhaps originate the proceedings with better effect in the kitchen. So into the kitchen he went. There were assembled in the lower house of domestic parliament the women servants, Mr. Brittles, Mr. Giles, the tinker, who had received a special invitation to regale himself for the remainder of the day in consideration of his services, and the constable. The latter gentleman had a large staff, a large head, large features, and large half boots, and looked as if he had been taking a proportionate allowance of his ale, as indeed he had. The adventures of the previous night were still under discussion, for Mr. Giles was expatiating upon his presence of mind when the door entered, and Mr. Brittles, with a mug of ale in his hand, was corroborating everything before his superior said it.
Still, still, said the doctor, waving his hand. Thank you, sir, said Mr. Giles. Mrs. wished some ale to be given out, sir, and as I feel no ways inclined for my own little room, sir, and was disposed to accompany, I am taking mine along here.
Brittles heeded a low murmur, by which the ladies and gentlemen generally were understood to express the gratification they derived from Mr. Giles' condescension. Mr. Giles looked round with patronizing air, as much to say that so long as they behaved properly, he would never desert them.
So a scrap, Mr. Giles. Well, I don't mean to say, sir, said Mr. Giles, trembling, that he's going to die. If I thought it, I should never be happy again. I wouldn't cut a boy off, no, not even Brittles here, not for all the plate in the country, sir. That's not the point, said the doctor mysteriously. Mr. Giles, are you a Protestant? Yes, I should hope so, faltered Mr. Giles, who turned very pale. What are you, boy? Said the doctor, turning sharply upon Brittles.
You'll bless me, sir, replied Brittles, starting violently. I'm the same as Mr. Giles, sir.
Then tell me this, said the doctor. Both of you. Are you going to take upon yourselves to swear that the boy upstairs is the boy that was put through the little window last night? Out with it. Come, we are prepared for you.
The doctor, who was universally considered one of the best-tempered creatures on earth, made this demand in such a dreadful tone of anger that Giles and Brittles, who were considerably muddled by ale and excitement, stared at each other in a state of stupefaction.
Pay attention to the reply, Constable, will you? Said the doctor, shaking his forefinger with great solemnity of manner and tapping the bridge of his nose with it, to bespeak the exercise of that worthy's most acuteness. Something may come of this before long.
The constable looked as wise as he could, took up his staff of office, which had been reclining indolently in the chimney corner.
"It's a simple identity question, you will observe," said the doctor.
"That's what it is, sir,"
replied the constable, coughing with great violence, for he had finished his ale in a hurry. Some of it had gone down the wrong way.
"Here's a house broken into," said the doctor, "and a couple of men catch a moment's glimpse of a boy in the midst of gunpowder smoke, and in all the distraction of alarm and darkness, here's a boy that comes to the very same house the next morning because he happens to have his arm tied up, and these men lay violent hands upon him, by doing which they place his life in great danger, and swear he is a thief. Now the question is whether these men are justified by the fact, and if not, what situation do they place themselves?"
The constable nodded profoundly. He said if that wasn't locked, he would be glad to know what was.
I'll ask you again,
Thundered the doctor.
are you and your sailor mates able to identify that boy?
Brittles looked doubtfully at Mr. Giles. Mr. Giles looked doubtfully at Brittles. The constable put his hand to his ear to catch the reply. The two women and the tinker leaned forward to listen, and the doctor glanced keenly round when a ring was heard at the gate. In the same moment the sound of wheels.
It's the runners.
Cried Brittles, to all appearance much relieved.
What?
Exclaimed the doctor, aghast in his turn.
Bow Street officers, sir,
Replied Brittles, taking up a candle.
me and Mr. Giles sent for 'em this morning. What?
Cried the doctor.
Yes,
Replied Brittles.
I sent a message up by coachman, and I only wonder if they weren't here before, sir. You detected you, then confound your slow coaches down here. That's all.
Said the doctor, walking away. Chapter 31 involves a critical position. Yep, that one's, I guess, where we're going to end it for now. And then I'll try and get through another 3 or 4 chapters tomorrow, and we'll see how we're feeling. But new named characters. This is going to be a really, really complicated character alignment sheet for this book. But that's like half the fun in this at this point. I really do enjoy making those character alignment sheets for everybody. Must have been like a full 3 days before I finally decided on where I wanted to put people on the Catch-22 alignment. And I think a few people are still mad because some of the characters in the book are quite a bit different than the characters in the movie and the mini series, all by the same name. So, yeah. If there are any more questions or any more conspiracy theories that come to mind, now's the time to bring them up. I'm going to repeat one more time. 19 CV 2407 CABAHG, written out in the live chat comments for everybody. Perhaps the most important case of this day and age, because it's really going to determine how AI, 5G computing, and really just all the technology of the future can be used with people. People really have to take a moment to consider that we need to know things on our own, and we need to be able to think critically in order to really survive in this world. So I encourage getting some time outside and being completely unplugged for like an hour or two every day at least. That being said, definitely appreciate everyone who showed up today. I've had quite a few people who just been sitting here silently listening to me read, and that's been fun. If you're enjoying this content, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing. And I'm out for the evening, so we will be back again tomorrow. In the meantime, one love.